Is everybody ready for Dracula? Jonathan Harker's journal, kept in shorthand, May the 3rd, left Munich at 8:35 p.m. on the 1st of May, arriving at Vienna early the next morning. Should have arrived at 6:46, but the train was an hour late. The Budapest seems a wonderful place. From the glimpse that I got of it from the train, the little I could walk through the streets, I feared to go very far from the station, as we arrived late, would start as near the correct time as possible. The impression I had was that we were leaving the west and entering the east. The most western of splendid bridges over Dunbin, which is here of a noble width and depth, took us among the traditions of the Turkish rule. We left it in a good time and came after nightfall to Kassenberg. Here I stopped for the night at the Hotel Royal. I had dinner, or rather supper, a chicken done up some way with red pepper, which was very good, but thirsty. Got the recipe from Maya. I asked the waiter, and he said it was called paprika hind, and that as it was a national dish, I should be able to get it anywhere along the Carpathians. I found my smattering of German very useful here indeed. I did not know how I should be able to get on without it. Having had some time at my disposal, when in London I had visited the British Museum, made the search among the books and maps in the library regarding Transylvania. It had struck me that some foreknowledge of the country could hardly fail to have some importance in dealing with a noble of that country. I find that the district he named is in the extreme east of the country, just on the borders of the three states, Transylvania, Moldavia, and Balkavia, in the midst of the Carpathian Mountains, one of the widest and least known portions of Europe. I was not able to light on any map or work giving the exact location of Castle Dracula, as there are no maps of this country as of yet to compare with our own ordnance survey maps, but I found that the Briston, the post town named by Count Dracula, in a fairly well-known place. I shall enter here some of my notes, as they may refresh my memory when I talk over my travels. Maya, in the population of Transylvania, there are 4 distinct nationalities: the Saxons in the south, and the mixed with them the Wallach, who are the descendants of the Drakkens, and the Mazgarans in the west, the Zekiels in the east and north. I'm going among the latter, who claim to be descendant from Attila the Hun. This may be so, for when the Margans conquered the country in the 11th century, they found the Huns settled in it. I read that every known superstition in the world is gathered into a horseshoe of the Carpathians, as if it were the center of some imagined whirlpool. If, as my stay may be very interesting, I must ask the Count all about them. I did not sleep well, though my bed was comfortable enough, for I had all sorts of queer dreams. There was a dog howling all night under my window, which may have had something to do with it, or it may have been the paprika, for I had to drink up all the water in my craft, and was still thirsty. Towards morning I slept, and was weakened by the continuous knocking at my door, so I guess I must have been sleeping soundly then. I had for the breakfast more paprika and a sort of porridge of maize flour, which they said was margin and eggplant stuffed with force meat, a very excellent dish which they called impeleta. I must get this recipe also. I had to hurry breakfast, for the train started a little before 8, or rather it ought to have done so, for after rushing to the station at 7:30, I had to sit in the carriage for more than an hour before we began to move. It seems to me that the further east you go, the more unpunctual are the train. What ought they be to be in China? All day long we seemed to dawdle through a country which was full of beauty and very kind. Sometimes we saw little towns or castles on the top of steep hills, such as we seen in the old missals. Sometimes we ran by rivers and streams which seemed from the wide stone margins on each side of them to be subject to the great floods. It takes a lot of water and running strong to sweep the outside edge of a river clear. At every station there were groups of people, sometimes crowds, and in all sorts of attire. Some of them were just like the peasants at home, or those I saw coming through France and Germany, with short jackets and round hats and homemade trews. But others were very picturesque. The women looked pretty, except when you got near them. They were very clumsy about the waist. They had all full white sleeves of some kind or another, and most of them had big belts with a lot of stripes of something fluttering from them, like the dresses in a ballet. But of course there were petticoats under them. The strange figures we saw were the sulks, who were more barbarian than the rest, with their big cowboy hats, great baggy dirt white trews, white linen shirts, and enormous heavy leather belts near a foot wide, all studded with brass nails. They wore high boots with their trews tucked into them, and had long black hair and heavy mustaches. They were very picturesque, but do not look pre-processing. On the stage they would be set down at once as some old oriental band or brigand. They were, however, I'm told, very harmless and rather waiting in natural self-assertion. It was on the dark side of twilight when we got to Bristol, which is a very interesting old place, being practical on the frontier, for the Bargo Pass leads from it to Bulgaria. It has had a very stormy existence, and it certainly shows marks on it. 50 years ago, a series of great fires took place, which made terrible havoc on 5 separate occasions. At the very beginning of the 17th century, it underwent a siege of 3 weeks and lost 13,000 people, the casualties of the war proper being assisted by famine and disease. Count Dracula had directed me to go to the Golden Krone Hotel, which I found to my great delight to be thoroughly old-fashioned, for of course I wanted to see all I could of the ways of the country, evidently expected, for when I got near the door I faced a cheerful-looking elderly woman in the usual peasant dress, white undergarment with long double apron, front and back, of colorful stuff fitting almost too tight for modesty. When I came close, she bowed and said, "The Herr Englishman?" "Yes," I said, "Jonathan Hawker." She smiled and gave some message to an elderly man in white sleeves who had followed her to the door. He went, but immediately returned with a letter. "My friend, welcome to the Carpathians. I am anxiously expecting you. Sleep well tonight, and at 3 tomorrow the diligence will start in Bulgaria. A place on it is kept for you. At the Bargo Pass, my carriage will await you and will bring you to me. I trust that your journey from London has been happy one, and that you will enjoy your stay in my beautiful land. Your friend, Dracula." May 4th. I found that my landlord had got a letter from the Count, directing him to secure the best place on the coach for me, but on making inquiries as to details he seemed somewhat reluctant, and pretended that he could not understand my German. This could not be true, because up to then he had understood it perfectly. At least he answered my questions exactly as if he did. He and his wife, the old lady who received me, looked at each other in a frightened sort of way. He muttered out that the money had been sent in a letter, and that was all he knew. And when I asked him if he knew Count Dracula and could tell me anything of his castle, both he and his wife crossed themselves, saying that they knew nothing at all, and simply refused to speak further. It was so near the time of starting that I had no time to ask anyone else, for it was all very mysterious and not by any means comforting. Just before I was leaving, the old lady came up to my room and said in a very hysterical way, "You must go, oh young hare, you must go." She is in such an excited state that she seemed to have lost her grip of what German she knew and mixed it up with some other language which I did not know at all. I was able to follow her by asking many questions, but when I told her that I must go at once and that I was engaged on important business, she asked again, "Do you know what day it is?" And I answered that it was the 4th of May. She shook her head as if to say again, "Oh yes, I know that, but do you know what day it is?" On my saying that I did not understand, she went on, "It is the eve of St. George's Day. Do you know that tonight, when the clock strikes midnight, all the evil things in the world have full sway? Do you know where you're going and what you're going to?" She was in such evident distress, I tried to comfort her, but without effect. Finally, she went down on her knees and implored me not to go, at least to wait a day or two before starting. It was all very ridiculous. I did not feel comfortable. However, there was business to be done, and I could allow nothing to interfere with it. I therefore tried to raise her up, and said as gravely as I could that I thanked her, but my duty was imperative, and that I must go. And then she rose and dried her eyes, taking a crucifix from her neck, offered it to me. I did not know what to do, for as an English churchman, I have been taught to regard such things in such measures as idiots, and yet it seems ungracious to refuse an old lady meaning so well. In such a state of mind, she saw, I suppose, the doubt in my face, for she put the rosemary around my neck and said, "For your mother's sake," went out of the room. I am writing up this part of the diary while I am waiting for the coach, which is, of course, late, and the crucifix is still around my neck. Whether it is the old lady's fear or the many ghostly traditions of this place, the crucifix itself, I do not know, but I am not feeling nearly as easy in my mind as usual. And if this book should ever reach Maya before I do, let it bring my goodbye. Here comes the coach. May 5th, the castle. The gray of the morning has passed, and the sun is high over this distant horizon, which seemed jagged, whether with trees or hills I know not, for it is so far off that the big things and the little are mixed. I am not sleepy, and as I am not to be called till I wake, naturally I write until sleep comes. There are many odd things to put down, and at least who reads them may fancy what I dine too well, but, before I left Brixton, let me put down my dinner exactly. On what they called the robber steak, bits of bacon, onion, beef, seasoned with red pepper, and strung on sticks and roasted over the fire. It is simply a simple style of London's cat's meat. The wine was golden Mescal, which produces a queer sting on the tongue, which is, however, not disagreeable. I had only a couple of glasses of this and nothing else. When I got on the coach, the driver had not taken his seat, and I saw him talking to the landlady. They were evidently talking of me, for every now and then they looked at me, and some of the people who were sitting on the bench outside the door, which they called by name, meaning world bearer, came and listened, and then looked at me, most of them pityingly. I could hear a lot of words, often repeated, queer words, for there were many nationalities in the crowd. So I quietly got on my Polyglot dictionary from my bag and looked them out. I must say they were not cheering to me, for amongst them were Ordog, Satan, Polak, Hell, Witch, Varduk, and Vaska, both of which mean the same thing, one being Salvak and the other Salvin, for something that is either werewolf or vampire. I must ask the Count about these superstitions. When we started, the crowd around the inn door, which had by this time swelled to a considerable size, all made the sign of the cross, pointed two fingers towards me with some difficulty. I got a fellow passenger to tell me what they meant. He would not answer at first, but on learning that I was English, he explained that it was a charm or guard against the evil eye. This was not very pleasant for me, just starting for an unknown place to meet an unknown man, but everyone seemed kind hearted and so sorrowful, so sympathetic, that I could not but be touched. I shall never forget the last glimpse of which I had of the inn yard and its crowd of picturesque figures all crossing themselves as they stood around the wide arch, with its background of rich foliage of oleander and orange trees in green tubs crushed in the center of the yard. Then our driver, whose wide linen drawers covered the whole front of the box seat, Gatza they call them, cracked his big whip over his four small horses, which ran abreast, and we set off on our journey. I soon lost sight of the recollection of the ghostly fears and the beauty of the scene as we drove along. Although I had known the language, or rather languages, which my fellow passengers were speaking, I might not have been able to throw them off so easily. Before we lay a green sloping land full of forest and woods, with the here and there steep hills crowned with clumps of trees, or the farmhouses, the bank gable end to the road. There was everywhere a bewildering mass of fruit blooms, apple, plum, pear, cherry, and we drove by. I could see the green grass under the trees sparkled with the fallen petals. In and out amongst the green hills of what they call here the Mittel land ran the road, lost itself in a sweep around the grassy curve, or was shut out by the staggering ends of pine woods, which here and there ran down the hillsides like tongues of flame. The road was rugged, but still we seemed to fly over it with a feverish haste. I could not understand then what the haste meant, but the driver was evidently bent on losing no time in reaching the Boreal Pond. I was told that this road is in the summertime is excellent, but that it had yet been put in order after the winter snows. In this respect, it is different from the general run of roads in the Carpathians, for it is an old tradition that they not be kept in too good order of the old hospodars who would not repair them, lest the Turks should think that they were preparing to bring in foreign troops, and so hasten the war, which was always really at loading point. Beyond the green swelling hills of the Mittel lands rose mighty slopes of forest up the loft sleeps of the Carpathians themselves. Right and left of us they towered with the afternoon sun falling full upon them and bringing out of the glorious colors of this beautiful range, deep blue and purple in the shadows of the peaks, green and brown where the grass and rocks mingled, and the endless perspective of jagged rock and pointed crags, till these were themselves lost in the distance, where the snowy peaks rose grandly. Here and there seemed mighty rifts in the mountains through which, as the sun began to sink, we saw now and again in the white gleam of falling water. One of my companions touched my arm as we swept around the base of the hill and opened up the lofty snow-covered peak of a mountain, which seemed, as we wound on our serpentine way, to be right there before us. Look, Godsey! And he crossed himself reverently. As we wound our endless way, the sun sank lower and lower behind us, and the shadows of the evening began to creep around us. This was empathized by the fact that the snowy mountain top still held the sunset and seemed to glow out with a delicate cool pink. Here and there we passed the Zeks and Sockets in all picturesque attire, but I noticed that the guitar was painfully prevalent. By the road were many crosses, and as we swept by, my companions all crossed themselves. Here and there was a peasant man or woman kneeling before a shrine, who did not turn around as we approached, but it seemed in the self-surrender of devotion to have neither eyes nor ears for the outer world. There were many things new to me. For instance, the hayricks in the trees here and there, beautiful masses of weeping birches, their white stems shining like silver through the delicate green of leaves. And now and again we passed a lighter wagon, the ordinary peasant's cart, with its long snake-like reberum and calculated to suit the equalities of the road. On this were such to be seated quite a group of homecoming peasants, the Czechs with their white attire, and the Slavs with their colored sheepskins, and latter carrying lance fashion, their long staves with an axe at the end. As the evening fell, it began to get very cold, and the growing twilight seemed to merge into one dark mistiness of gloom of the trees, oak, birch, and pine, though in the valleys which ran deep between the spurs of the hills, we ascended through the pass, and the dark firs stood out here and there against the background of late-lying snow. Sometimes, as the road was cut through the pine woods that seemed in the darkness to be closing down upon us, great masses of grayness, which here and there bestowed the trees, produced a particular weird and solemn effect, which carried on the thoughts and grim fancies endangered earlier in the evening, when the following sunset threw into strange relief the ghost-like clouds which amongst the Carpathians seemed to wind ceaselessly through the hills. Sometimes the hills were so steep that, despite our driver's haste, the horses could only go slowly. I wished to get down and walk them as we do at home, but the driver would not hear of it. No, no, he said, we must not walk here. The dogs are too fierce. And then he added, with what he evidently meant for grim pleasantry, for he looked around to catch an approving smile of the rest, and you may have enough of such matters before you to go to sleep. The only stop he would make was a moment's pause to light his lamps, and then in the dark there seemed to be some excitement amongst the passengers, as they kept speaking to him, and one after the other, as though urging him to further speed, he lashed the horses unmercifully with his long whip, and with wild cries of encouragement urged them on to the further extensions. Then, through the darkness, I could see a sort of patch of gray light ahead of us, as though there were a cleft in the hills. The excitement of the passengers grew greater. The crazy coach rocked on its great leather springs and swayed like a boat tossed on the stormy sea. I had to hold on. The road grew more level, and we appeared to fly along. The mountains seemed to come nearer to us on each side and to frown down upon us as we were entering on the Bargo Pass. One by one, several of the passengers offered me gifts, which they pressed on to me with a certain eagerness which would take no denial. These were certainly of an odd and various kind, but each was given in simple good faith, with a kindly word and a blessing. Mixture of fear-meaning movements which I had seen outside the hotel, the sign of the cross and the guard against the evil eye, and then we flew along, and the driver leaned forward, and on each side of the passengers, craning over the edge of the coach, peered eagerly into the darkness. It was evident that something very exciting was either happening or expected, but though I asked each passenger, no one could give me the slightest explanation. This state of excitement kept on for a little time. At last we saw before us the pass opening out on the eastern side. There were dark rolling clouds overhead, and in the air heavy oppressive sense of thunder. It seemed as though the mountain range had separated two atmospheres, and that we now had to go into the thunderous one. I was now myself looking out for the conveyance which was to take me to the Count. Each moment I expected to see a glare of lamps through the darkness, but all was dark. The only light was the flickering rays of our own lamps, in which the steam from our hard-driven horses rose in a white cloud. We could see now the sandy road lying white before us, but there was on it no sign of a vehicle. The passengers drew back on with a sigh of gladness which seemed to mock my own disappointment. I was already thinking that I had best do when the driver, looking on his watch, said to the others something that I could hardly hear. It was spoken so quietly, in so low a tone, I thought it was an hour less than the time. Then turning to me, he said in German, worse than my own, "There is no carriage here. The heir is not expected after all. He will now come to Bolkavia and return tomorrow on the next day, better the next day." Whilst he was speaking, the horses began to neigh and snort and plunge wildly, so that the driver had to hold them up. Then, amongst a chorus of screams from the peasants and a universal crossing of themselves, a clans with 4 horses drove up upon us, overtook us, and drew beside the coach. I could see from the flash of our lamps, as the rays fell on them, the horses were coal-black and splendid animals. They were driven by a tall man with a long brown beard and a great black hat, which seemed to hide his face from us. I could only see the gleam of a pair of very bright eyes, which seemed red in the lamplight. As he turned to us, he said to the driver, "You are early tonight, my friend," the man stammered in reply. "The English heir was in a hurry," to which the stranger replied, "That is why I suppose you wish him to go on to Bolkavia. You cannot deceive me, my friend. I know too much. My horses are swift." As he spoke, he smiled, and the lamplight fell on a hard-looking mouth with very red lips and sharp-looking teeth as white as ivory. One of my companions whispered to another the line from Burger's Honor, for the dead travel fast. The strange driver evidently heard the words, for he looked up with a gleaming smile. The passenger turned his face away, at the same time putting out his 2 fingers and crossing himself. "Give me the heir's luggage," said the driver, and with an exceeding arcity my bags were handed out and put in the caleche. Then I descended from the side of the coach. As the caleche was alongside, the driver helping me with a hand which caught my arm in a grip of steel. His strength must have been prodigious. Without a word, he took his reins, and the horses turned, and we swept into the darkness of the pass. As I looked back, I saw the steam from the horses of the coach by the light of the lamps that projected against it the figures of my late companions crossing themselves, when the driver cracked his whip and called to his horses, and off they swept on their way to Bolkavia. As they sank into the darkness, I felt a strange chill. A lonely feeling came over me, but a cloak was thrown over my shoulders and a rug across my knees, and the driver said in excellent German, "The night is chill, mein Herr, and my master, the Count, bade me take all care of you. There is a flask of plum brandy of the country underneath the seat, if you should require it." I did not take any, but it was a comfort to know that it was there all the same. I felt a little strange and not a little frightened. I think had there been an alternative, I would have taken it instead of prosecuting the unknown night journey. The carriage went at a hard pace straight along, and then we made a complete turn and went along another straight road. It seemed to me they were simply going over and over the same ground again, so I took note of some salient point and found that this was so. I might have liked to have asked the driver what this was all meant, but I had really feared to do so, for I had thought that, placed as I was, any protest would have had no effect in case there had been any intention to delay. By and by, however, I was curious to know how time was passing. I struck a match, and by its flame looked at my watch. It was within a few minutes of midnight. This gave me a sort of shock, as I suppose the general superstition about midnight was increased by my recent experience. I waited with a sick feeling of suspense. Then a dog began to howl somewhere in the farmhouse far down the road, a long agonizing wail as it was from fear. The sound was taken by another dog, and then another and another, till borne on the wind which now sighed softly through the pass, a wild howling began, which seemed to come from all over the country, as far as the imagination could grasp it through the gloom of the night. And at this first howl the horses began to strain and rear, but the driver spoke to them smoothly, and they quieted down, but shivered and sweated as though after a runaway from sudden fright. Then, as far off in the distance from the mountains on each side of us began a louder and sharper howling of the wolves, which affected both the horses and myself in the same way. For I was minded to jump from the chalet and run, while they reared again and purred madly, as that the driver had to use all his great strength to keep them from bolting. In a few minutes, however, my own ears got accustomed to the sound, and the horses so far became quiet that the driver was to descend to the stand before them. He petted and smoothed them, and whispered something in their ears, as I've heard of horse tamers doing, with extraordinary effect, for under his caresses they became quite manageable again, though they still trembled. The driver again took his seat, and shaking his reins, started off at a great pace. This time, after going to the far side of the pass, he suddenly turned down a narrow roadway which ran sharply to the right. Soon we were hemmed in with the trees, which in places arched right over the roadway till we passed through a tunnel, and again great frowning rocks guarded us boldly on either side. Though we were in shelter, we could hear the rising wind, for the moaned and whistled through the rocks, and the branches of the trees crashed together as we swept along. It grew colder and colder still, and fine powdery snow began to fall, so that soon we and all around us were covered in a white blanket. The keen wind was still carried the howling of the dogs, so this grew fainter as we went on our way. The baying of the wolves sounded nearer and nearer, as though they were closing around us as from every side. I grew dreadfully afraid, and the horses shared my fear. The driver, however, was not in the least disturbed. He kept turning his head to the left and right, but I could not see anything through the darkness. Suddenly, away on our left, I saw a faint flickering blue flame. The driver saw it at the same moment, and he at once checked the horses, and jumping to the ground, disappeared into the darkness. I did not know what to do. The less of the howling of the wolves grew closer, but while I wondered, the driver suddenly appeared again, and without a word took his seat and resumed our journey. I think I must have fallen asleep and kept dreaming of the incident, for it seemed to be repeated endlessly, and now, in looking back, it is like a sort of awful nightmare. Once the flame appeared so near the road that even in the darkness around us I could watch the driver's motions. He went rapidly to where the blue flame arose. It must have been very faint, or it did not seem to illuminate the place around it at all, and gathered a few stones, formed them into some device, and once there appeared a strange optical effect. When he stood between me and the flame, he did not obstruct it, for I could see its ghostly flicker all the same. This startled me, but as the effect was only momentary, I took it with my eyes deceived, straining through the darkness. Then for a time there were no blue light flames, and we sped onward through the gloom with the howling of the wolves around us, as though we were following in a moving circle. At last there came a time when the driver went further afield than he had let go, and during his absence the horses began to tremble worse than ever, snort and scream with fright. I could not see any cause for this, for the howling of the wolves had ceased altogether. But just then the moon, sailing through the black clouds, appeared behind the jagged crest of a beetling pine chadrach, and by its light I saw around us a ring of wolves with white teeth and rolling red tongues, with long, skewy limbs and shaggy hair. There were hundreds times more terrible in the grim silence which held them then, even when they howled. For myself, I felt a sort of paralyzing of fear. It is only then a man feels himself face to face with such horrors that he can understand their true import. All at once the wolves began to howl, as though the moonlight had some particular effect on them. The horses jumped out and reared and looked helplessly around with eyes, and rolled away painfully to see, but the living ring of terror encompassed them on every side, and they had to perform to remain within it. I called to the coachman to come, for it seemed to me that our only chance was to try to break through the ring and to aid his approach. I shouted and beat the side of the cart, hoping to, by the noise, to scare the wolves from that side, so as to give him a chance to reach the trap. How he came there, I do not know. I heard his voice raising a tone of an impervious command, and looking towards the sound, I saw him stand in the roadway. As he swept his long arms as though brushing aside some impalpable obstacle, the wolves fell back, and further still. Just then, a heavy cloud passed just the face of the moon, so we were again in darkness. And when I could see again, the driver was climbing onto the cart, and the wolves had disappeared. This was all so strange and uncanny that a dreadful fear came upon me, as I was afraid to speak or move. The time seemed indeterminate as we swept on our way, now in almost complete darkness, for the rolling clouds obscured the moon. We kept on ascending, with an occasional period of quick descent, but in the main always ascending. Suddenly I became conscious of the fact that the driver was in the act of pulling up the horses in a courtyard of a vast ruined castle. For those tall black windows came no ray of light, and those broken battlements showed a jagged line against the moonlight sky. Chapter 2. Jonathan Harker's Journal continued. May the 5th. I must have been asleep, for certainly if I had been fully awake I must have noticed the approach of such a remarkable place. In the gloom the courtyard looked of considerable size, and as several dark ways led from it under great round arches, it seemed perhaps bigger than it really is. I had not yet been able to see it by daylight. When the cart stopped, the driver jumped down and held out his hand to assist me to alight. Again I could not but notice his strength. His hand actually seemed to be steel vice that could have crushed mine if he had chosen. Then he took out my traps and placed them on the ground beside me as I stood close to the great door, old and studded with large nails, and set in a projecting doorway of a massive stone. I could see even in the dim light that the stone was massively carved, but that the carving had been much worn by the time and weather. As I stood, the driver jumped again into his seat and shook the reins. The horses started forward, and the trap and all disappeared down one of the dark openings. I stood in silence where I was, for I did not know what to do. Of bell or knocker there was no sign, though those frowning walls and dark windows opening, it was not likely that my voice could penetrate. The time I waited seemed endless, and I felt doubts and fears crowding upon me. What sort of place had I come to? Among what kind of people? What sort of grim adventure was on which I had embarked? Was this a customary incident in the life of a solicitor clerk sent out to explain the purchase of a London estate to a foreigner? A solicitor's clerk. Maya would not like that. A solicitor, for just before leaving London, I got word that my examination was successful, and am now a full-blown solicitor. I began to rub my eyes and pinch myself to see if I were awake. It all seemed like a horrible nightmare to me, and I expected that I should suddenly awake and find myself at home with the dawn struggling in through the lights, as I had now again felt the morning after a day of overwork. But my flesh answered the pinching test, and my eyes were not to be deceived. I was indeed awake and among the Carpathians. All I could do now was be patient and to wait the coming of morning. Just as I had come to this conclusion, I heard a heavy step approaching behind the great door, and saw through the clinks of the gleaming of a coming light. Then there was the sound of rattling chains and the clinking of a massive bolt thrown back. A key was turned with a loud grating noise of long disuse, and the great door swung back. Within stood a tall old man, clean-shaven, save for a long white mustache, and clad in black from head to foot, without a single speck of color about him anywhere. He held in his hand an antique silver lamp, in which the flame burned without chimney or globe of any kind, throwing long quivering shadows as it flickered in the draught of an open door. The old man motioned me in with his right hand, with a courtly gesture, saying in excellent English, but with a strange intonation, "Welcome to my house. Enter freely of your own will." He made no motion of stepping to meet me, but stood like a statue, as though his gesture of welcome had fixed him into the stone. The instant, however, that I had stepped over the threshold, he moved impetuously forward, and holding out his hand, grasped mine with a strength which made me wince, an effect which was not lessened by the fact that it seemed as cold as ice, and more than like the hand of a dead than a living man. Again he said, "Welcome to my house. Come freely, come safely, and leave something of the happiness you bring." The strength of the handshake was so much akin to that of which I had noticed in the driver, whose face I had not seen. For a moment I doubted if it were not the same person to whom I was speaking. To make sure, I interrogated Count Dracula. He bowed in a courtly way as he replied, "I am Dracula, and I bid you welcome, Mr. Harker, to my house. Come in. The night air is chill, and you must need to eat and rest." As he was speaking, he put the lamp onto a bracket on the wall, and stepping out, took my luggage. He had carried it in before I could forestall him. I protested, but he insisted. "Ah, sir, you are my guest. It is late, and my people are not available. Let me see to your comfort myself." He insisted on carrying my traps along the passage, and then up a great winding stair, and along another great passage, on whose stone floors our step rang heavily. At the end of this he threw open a heavy door, and rejoiced to see within a well-lit room, in which a table was spread for supper, and on those mighty hearth a great fire of logs freshly replenished flamed and flared. The Count halted, putting down my bags, closed the door, and crossed the room, opened up another door, which led into a small octavian room lit by a single lamp, and seemingly without a window of any sort. Passing through this, he opened another door, and motioned me to enter. It was welcome sight, for there was a great bedroom, well lit and warmed with another log fire, as added to but lately, for the top logs were fresh, which sent a hollow roaring up the wide chimney. The Count himself left my luggage inside and withdrew, saying before he closed the door, "You will need, after your journey, to refresh yourself by making your toilet. I trust you will find all you wish. When you are ready, come into the other room, where you will find your supper prepared." The light and warmth and the Count's courteous welcome seemed to have dissipated all my doubts and fears. Having then reached my normal state, I discovered that I was famished with hunger, so making a hasty toilet, I went into the other room. I found supper already laid out. My host, who stood on one side of the great fireplace, leaned against the stonework, made a grateful wave of his hand to the table, and said, I pray you, be seated, and sup how you please. You dine, you will, I trust, excuse me, that I do not join you, but I have dined already, and I do not sup. I handed to him the sealed letter which Mr. Hawkins had entrusted me. He opened it and read it gravely, and then with a charming smile he handed it to me to read. One passage of it, at least, gave me a thrill of pleasure. I must regret that the attack of gout from which my lady and I suffer forbids me absolutely any travel on my part for some time to come, but I am happy to say I can send a significant substitute, one in whom I have every possible confidence. He is a young man, full of energy and talent in his own way, and of a faithful disposition. He is discreet and silent, and has grown into manhood in my service. He shall be ready to attend on you when you will during his stay, and will take your instructions in all matters. The Count himself came forward and took off the cover of the dish, and I fell onto it once. An excellent roast chicken. This with some cheese, a salad, and a bottle of eau turquoise, of which I had 2 glasses with my supper. During this time I was eating, the Count asked me many questions as to my journey. I told him by degrees all I experienced, and by this time I had finished my supper, and my host's desire had driven up a chair by the fire and began to smoke a cigar which he offered me, at the same time excusing himself that he did not smoke. I had now an opportunity of observing him, and found him of a very marked physiognomy. His face was strong, a very strong aquiline, with a high bridge of a thin nose, and particular arched nostrils, with a lofty dome forehead, the hair growing scantily around the temples, but profusely everywhere else. His eyebrows were very massive, almost meeting over the nose, and with bushy hair that seemed to curl in on its own profusion. The mouth, as far as I could see it under a heavy mustache, was fixed with a rather cruel-looking, with peculiar sharp white teeth. These protruded over the lip. Those remarked rudeness showed astonishing vitality in a man of his years. For the rest, his ears were pale, and at the tops extremely pointed. The chin was broad and strong, and the cheeks firm though thin. The general effect was one of extraordinary pallor. Hitherto I noticed that the backs of his hands, as they lay on his knees in the firelight, and they had seemed rather white and fine, but seeming they now close to me, I could not but notice they were rather coarse, broad, with squat fingers. Strange to say, there were hairs in the center of the palm. The nails were long and fine, and cut to a sharp point. As the Count leaned over me and his hands touched me, I could not repress a shudder. It may have been that his breath was rank, but a horrible feeling of nausea came over me, which I could not conceal. The Count evidently noticed it and drew back. With a grim sort of smile, which showed more than he had yet done his protrusive teeth, he sat himself down on his own side of the fireplace. We were both silent for a while. As I looked towards the window, I saw the first dim streak of the coming dawn. There seemed to be a strange stillness over everything. But as I listened, I heard of this from down below, the valley of the howling many wolves. The Count's eyes gleamed, and he said, "Listen to 'em, the children of the night. What music they make!" Seeing, I suppose, some expression in my face, strange to him, he added, "Ah, sir, you dwellers in the city cannot enter into the feelings of the hunter." And he rose and said, "But you must be tired. Your bedroom is all ready, and tomorrow we shall sleep late as you will. I have to be away till the afternoon, so sleep well and dream well." and with a courteous bow, he opened for me himself the door to the octagonal room, and I entered my bedroom. I am all in a sea of wonders. I doubt, I fear, I think strange things which I cannot confess to my own soul. God keep me, if only for the sake of those dear me. May 7th. It is again early morning, but I have rested and enjoyed the last 24 hours. I slept till late in the day and woke of my own accord. And when I had dressed myself, I went into the room where we had supped and found a cold breakfast laid out, with coffee kept hot by the pot being placed on the hearth. There was a card on the table on which it was written, I have to be absent for a while. Don't wait for me. D. I set to and enjoyed my hearty meal. When I was done, I looked for a bell so that I might let the servants know I had finished, but I did not find one. There was a certain odd deficiencies in the house, considering the extraordinary effectiveness of wealth which are around me. The table be of immense value. The curtains and upholstery of the chairs and sofa and the hangings of my bed are of costly and most beautiful fabrics. Must have been fabulous value when they were made, for they are centuries old, though in excellent order. I saw something like them in Hampton Court, but they were worn and frayed with moth-eaten. But still, it is none of the rooms is there a mirror. There are not even a toilet glass on my table, and I had to get the little shaving glass from my bag before I could either shave or brush my hair. I have yet to have seen a servant anywhere, or heard a sound near the castle except the howling of the wolves, some time after I had finished my meal. I do not know whether or to call it breakfast or dinner, for it was between 5 and 6 o'clock when I had it. I looked about for something to read, for I did not like to go about the castle until I had asked the count's permission. There was absolutely nothing in the room, book, newspaper, or even written materials, so I opened another door in the room and found a sort of library. The door opposite mine I tried, but found it locked. In the library I found, to my great delight, a vast number of English books, whole shelves full of them, and bound volumes of magazines and newspapers. A table in the center was littered with English magazines and newspapers, though none of them were of very recent date. The books were of the most varied kind: history, geography, politics, political and economic, botany, geography, law, all the relating to England and English life, customs, and manners. There were even such books of reference as the London Dictionary, the Red and Blue books, the Whitaker's Almanac, the Army and Navy list, and it somehow gladdened my heart to see it, the law list. While I was looking at the books, the door opened and the Count entered. He saluted me in a hearty way and hoped that I had a good night's sleep, and then he went on. I'm glad you found your way in here, for I am sure there is much that will interest you. These companions, and he laid his hand on some of the books, have been good friends to me for some years past, ever since I had the idea of going to London, and have given me many, many hours of pleasure. Though through them I have come to know your great England, and to know her is to love her. I long to go through the crowded streets of your mighty London, to be in the midst of the whirlwind and rush of humanity, to share its life, its change, its death, and all that makes it what it is. But alas, as yet I only know your tongue through books. To you, my friend, I look that I know it to speak. But Count, I said, you know and speak English thoroughly. He bowed gravely. I thank you, my friend, for your all too flattery esteem, but yet I fear that I am but a little way on the road. I would travel, true, I know the grammar and the words, but yet I do not know how to speak them. Indeed, I said, you speak excellently. Not so, he answered. Well, I know that, but I do move and speak in your London. None there that are who would not know me for a stranger. That is not enough for me. Here I am a noble, I am a boyar, the common people know me, and I am master. But a stranger in a strange land, He is no one. Men know him not, and to know not is to care not for. I am content if I am like the rest, so that no man stops it if he sees me and pauses in his speaking. If he hear my words, ha ha, a stranger, I have been so long master that I would be master still, or at least that none other should be master of me. You come to me not alone as agent of my friend Peter Hawkins of Exeter to tell me all about my new estate in London. You shall, I trust, rest here with me a while, so that by our talking I may learn the English intonation, and I would that you tell me when I make an error, even of the smallest in my speaking. I am sorry that I had to be away so long today, but you will, I know, forgive one who has so many important affairs in hand? Of course, I said all I could about being willing, and asked if I might come into the room when I chose. He answered, yes, certainly, and added, you may go anywhere you wish in the castle, except where the doors are locked. Where, of course, you will not wish to go, there is a reason that all things are as they are. And did you see with my eyes and know with my knowledge, you would perhaps better understand. I said I was sure of this, and he went on. We are in Transylvania, and Transylvania is not England. Our ways are not your ways, and there shall be to you many strange things. Nay, from what you have told me of your experiences already, you know something of what strange things there may be. This led to much conversation, and as it was evident that he wanted to talk, if only for talking's sake, I asked him many questions regarding things that had already happened to me or come within my notice. Sometimes he sheared off a subject and turned the conversation by pretending not to understand, but generally he answered all I asked most fairly, and then, as time went on, I got somewhat bolder. I asked him of some of the strange things of the preceding night, as, for instance, why the coachman went to the places where he had seen the blue flames. He then explained to me that it was commonly believed that on a certain night of the year, last night in fact, when all evil spirits are supposed to have unchecked sway, a blue flame is seen over any place where treasure has been concealed. That treasure has been hidden, he went on. In the region through which you came last night, there would have been little doubt, for it was the ground fought over the centuries by the Welchin, the Saxon, and the Turk. Why, there is hardly a foot of soil in all of the region that has not been enriched by the blood of men, patriots or invaders. In old days, there were stirring times when the Australian and the Hungarian came in the hordes, and the patriots went on to meet them, men and women, the aged and the children too, and waited their coming on the rocks above the passes, that they might sweep destruction on them with their artificial avalanches. And when the invader was triumphed, he fought but little, for whatever there was had been sheltered in the friendly soil. But how, and I said, can it be remaining so long undiscovered, when there is sure index to it if the men will but take the trouble to look? The Count smiled, and as his lips ran back over his gums, the long, sharp, canine teeth showed out strangely. He answered, because your peasants is at the heart of a coward, a fool, and those flames only appear on one night, and on the night no man of this land will, if he can help it, stir without his doors. And, dear sir, even if he did, he would not know what to do. Why, even the peasant that you tell me of, who marked the place of flames, would not know where to look in daylight, even if for his own work. Even you would not, I dare be sworn, be able to find those places again. There you are right, I said. I know no more than the dead were even to look at for them. Then we drifted on to other matters. Come, he said, tell me of London, and of the house which you have procured for me. With an apology for my remiss, I went into my own room to get the papers from my bag. While I was placing them in order, I heard a rattling of china and silver in the next room, and as I passed through, noticed that the table had been cleared and the lamp lit, for it was about this deep into the dark. Lamps were also lit in the study or library, and I found the Count lying on the sofa reading Of All Things in the World, an English Bradshaw guide. When I came in, he cleared the books and papers from the table, and with him I went into plans and deeds and figures of all sorts, and he was interested in everything, and asked me a myriad of questions about the place and its surroundings. He clearly had been studied beforehand all he could get on the subject of the neighborhood, for he evidently at the end knew very much more than I did. When I remarked this, he answered, well, but my friend, it is not needful that I should. When I go there, I shall be alone, and my friend Hawker, Jonathan, nay, pardon me, I fall into my country's habit of putting pardonymic first. My friend Jonathan Hawker will not be by myself to correct and aid me. He will be in Exeter, miles away, probably working up papers of the law with my other friend, Peter Hawkins. So we went thoroughly into the business of purchasing of the estate at Purfleet. When I had told him the facts and got his signature to the necessary papers, and had written a letter with them ready to the post to Mr. Hawkins, he began to ask me how I came across so suitable a place. I read to him the notes which I had made at the time, and which I inscribed here. At Purfleet, on by the road, I came across such a place as seemed to be required, and where was displayed a dilapidated notice that the place was for sale. It is surrounded by a high wall, an ancient structure built of heavy stones, and has not been repaired for a large number of years. The closed gates are of heavy old oak and iron, all eaten with rust. The estate is called the Carfax, no doubt a corruption of the old quarter face, as the house is four-sided, agreeing with the cardinal points of the compass. It contains in all some 20 acres, quite surrounded by the soiled stone wall above mentioned. There are many trees on it, which make it into a gloomy, and there is a deep, dark-looking pond or small lake, evidently fed by some springs, as the water is clear and flows away in a fair-sized stream. The house is very large, and of all periods back, I should say, to medieval times, for one part is stone immensely thick, only with a few windows high up and heavily barred with iron. It looks like part of a keep, and is close to an old chapel or church. I could not enter it, as I had not the key, and on the door leading to it from the house I had taken, with my Kodiak views of it at various points. The house had been added to, but in a very straggling way. I could only guess that the amount of ground it covers, which must be great. There are but a few houses close at hand, one being a very large house only recently added and formed into a private lunatic asylum. It is not, however, visible from the grounds. When I had finished, she said, I am glad that it is old and big. Myself, I am of an old family, and to live in a new house would kill me. A house cannot be made habitable in a day, and after all, how few days go to make a century. I rejoice also that there is a chapel of old times. We Transylvanian nobles love to not think that our bones may lie amongst the common dead. I seek not gaiety nor mirth, not the bright voluptuousness of the much sunshine and sparkling waters, which please the young and gay. I am no longer young, and my heart, though weary years of mourning over the dead, is not attuned to mirth. However, the walls of my castle are broken, and the shadows are many, and the wind breathes cold through the broken battlements. and castlements. I love the shade and the shadow and would be alone with my thoughts when I may. Somehow his words and his look did not seem to accord, or else it was that his cast of face made his smile look malignant and saturnine. Presently, with an excuse, he left me, asking me to put all my papers together. He was some little time away, and I began to look at some of the books around me. One was an atlas, which I found open naturally to England, as if the map had been much used. On looking at it, I found in certain places little rings marked, and examining these, I noticed that one was near London, on the east side, manifestly where his new estate was situated. The other two were Exeter and Whitby on the Yorkshire coast. It was the better part of an hour when the Count returned. "Allah," he said, "still at your books? Good. But you must not work always. Come, I am informed that your supper is ready." He took my arm and we went into the next room, where I found an excellent supper ready on the table. The Count again excused himself, as he had dined out on his being away from home. But as he sat on the previous night and chatted while I ate, after supper I smoked as on the last evening, and the Count stayed with me, chatting and asking questions on every conceivable subject. Hour after hour I felt that it was getting very late indeed, but I did not say anything, for I felt under obligation to meet my host's wishes in every way. I was not sleepy, as the long sleep yesterday had fortified me, but I could not help experiencing the chill which comes over one at the coming of the dawn, which is like it is in its way the turn of the tide. They say that the people who are near death die generally at the change of the dawn or at the turning of the tide. Anyone who has often tired as if it were his post, experienced this change in the atmosphere, can well believe it. All at once we heard the crow of a cock coming up with preternatural stillness through the clear morning air. Count Dracula jumped to his feet and said, "Why, there is the morning again. How remiss I am to let you stay up so long. Must make your conversation regarding my dear new country of England less interesting, so that I may not forget how time flies by us." And with a courtly bow, he quickly left me. I went into my own room and drew the curtains, but there was little to notice. My window opened into the courtyard, and all I could see was the warm gray of quickening sky, and so I pulled the curtains again and have written of this day. 8 May. I began to fear, as I write in this book, that I was getting to diffuse, for now I'm glad that I went into detail from the first, for there is something so strange about this place and all in it that I cannot but feel uneasy. I wish I were safe out of it, or that I had never come. It may be that this strange night experience is telling on me, but would that were all. If there were any one to talk to, I could bear it, but there is no one. I have only the Count to speak with, and he, I fear myself, the only living soul within this place. Let me Prozac so far the facts as can be. It will help me to bear up. The imagination must not run riot with me. If it does, I am lost. Let me say at once how I stand, or seem to. I only slept a few hours when I went to bed, and feeling that I could not sleep any more, got up. I hung my shaving glass by the window and was just beginning to shave, and suddenly I felt a hand on my shoulder and heard the Count's voice saying to me, "Good morning." I startled, for it amazed me that I had not seen him since the reflection of the glass covered the whole room behind me, and in staring I had cut myself slightly, but did not notice it at the moment. Having answered the Count's salutation, I turned to the glass again to see I had been mistaken. This time there would be no error, for the man was close to me, and I could see him over my shoulder, but there was no reflection of him in the mirror. The whole room behind me was displayed, but there was no sign of a man except myself. This was startling, and coming on the top of so many strange things was beginning to increase the vague feeling uneasiness which I've always had when the Count is near. But at that instant I saw the cut head blood a little, and the blood was trickling over my chin. I laid down the razor, turning as I did so half around to look for some sticking plaster. When the Count saw my face, his eyes ablaze with a sort of demonic fury, and he suddenly made a grab at my throat. I drew away, and his hand touched the string of the beads which held the crucifix. It made an instant change in him, for the fury passed so quickly that I could hardly believe that it was ever there. Take care, he said. Take care how you cut yourself. It is more dangerous than you should think in this country. Then, seizing the shaving glass, he went on, and this is the wretched thing that has done the mischief. It is foul bowel of man's vanity. Away with it! And opening the heavy window with one wrench of his terrible hand, he flung out the glass, which was shattered into 1,000 pieces on the stones of the courtyard far below. And then he withdrew without a word, and it's very annoying, for I do not see how I am to shave unless it is in my watch case or the bottom of the shaving pot, which is fortunately of metal. When I went into the dining room, breakfast was prepared, but I did not find the Count anywhere, so I breakfasted alone. It was strange that as yet I had not seen the Count eat or drink. He must be a very particular man. After breakfast, I did a little exploring in the castle. I went out on the stairs and found a room looking towards the south. The view was magnifique, and from where I stood, there was every opportunity of seeing it. The castle is on the very edge of a terrible pinnacle, and a stone falling from the window could fall 1,000 feet without touching anything. As far as the eye can reach is a sea of green treetops, with occasionally a deep rift where there is a chasm. Here and there are silver threads where the rivers wind in deep gorges through the forest. I'm not in the heart of describe the beauty, for when I had seen the view, I explored further. Doors everywhere, all locked and bolted. In no place save from the windows in the castle walls is there an available exit. The castle is a virtual prison, and I am a prisoner.